Okay, so today we're going to start talking about indexing with suffixes. So up to now we talked about some indexing approaches that are based on extracting substrings from the text T and then putting them into some kind of map data structure. A very different approach from this is, instead of extracting substrings from T, to extract all of the suffixes from T. And this is going to lead us to some data structures that surprisingly are actually quite concise and in fact are pretty practical. Very modern tools for solving the read alignment problem, the problem of trying to figure out where all these sequence reads came from with respect to a reference genome, use approaches like the ones I'm showing you on this slide, especially the suffix array and the FM index. Those are quite popular. So we're going to start, though, by talking about the suffix try. The suffix try is in itself not a very practical data structure, but it's going to help us think about the other data structures on the slide. So to build a suffix try, all we need to do is build a try that contains all of the suffixes of our text T. So if this is our text T at the top, the black string at the top, I'm showing you in red all of the suffixes, all of the non-empty suffixes of T. And if T is of length M, then the total number of characters in all of the suffixes of T is M times M plus 1 over 2. So the number of characters in the suffixes of a text T, if the length of T is M, it grows with M squared. So at first glance, it's going to seem like a bit of a challenge to figure out how to make a concise data structure over all the suffixes of a text T. Before we build a suffix try of a text T, we're first going to add a special terminator character, which we represent with a $sign. This terminator character, this $sign, this is defined to be a character that does not appear elsewhere in T, and we define it to be less than the other characters. So it's alphabetically or lexicographically less than all of the other characters in the alphabet. So for example, the ordering for the DNA alphabet might be $sign is less than A, which is less than C, which is less than G, which is less than T. And you'll see the role that the $sign plays a little later on, but intuitively you can think of the $sign as enforcing a rule that we're all kind of used to, which is when we're trying to put words in dictionary order, and we have a word that's a prefix of another word, we know the rule, which says that the shorter of the two words goes first alphabetically. You can think of the $sign as kind of it removes the need to have a special rule for resolving that case, because the $sign always makes it unambiguous what the lexicographical order of two suffixes are. So let's remind ourselves what a try is. We said that a try is the smallest tree, such that each edge in the tree is labeled with some character from our alphabet sigma. A node has at most one outgoing edge labeled with C, where C is some character from the alphabet sigma. And each key is spelled out along some path starting at the root. In other words, if you follow edge labels starting from the root and walking down through the tree, you can spell out each key along one of those paths. So let's make a suffix try now. So here's a string. Here's our string T. T is ABA, ABA. As we said, the first thing we're going to do is add this special $sign character, the terminator character, to the end of T. And now we're going to build a suffix try of T$. We're going to take all the suffixes of T$ and put them into a try. So a good exercise would be to pause and see if you can easily write down the try for this string. Here's the suffix try. If you look at this suffix try and think about what the paths through this try mean, you can see that each path from the root to a leaf represents one suffix of the string T$, and that each suffix of T$ is represented by some path from the root to the leaf. In other words, there's a one-to-one mapping between leaf nodes in this tree and suffixes of T$. So for example, this blue path here corresponds to the shortest non-empty suffix of T$, which is just the suffix consisting of just the $sign character. And then this path that I've labeled in green corresponds to the longest suffix of $, ABA, $sign. So would this property be the case? Would this still hold if we hadn't added the $sign to the end of $? So this statement that each path from root to leaf represents a suffix and that each suffix is represented by some path from root to leaf, would that still be true if we hadn't added the $sign? No, it wouldn't. So here on the right, I'm showing you a picture of essentially the same. This is now a suffix trie for the string t without the added $sign. You can see it's a little bit simpler than the suffix trie from the previous figure. And you can pick a suffix. So let's pick the suffix ABA. And you can see that if you walk down from the root and follow the edges that are labeled A and then B and then A, you end up on a node that's in the middle of the trie. You're not at a leaf node. So the statement is no longer true. So this is one of the functions of the $signs, is it helps us enforce this property that there's a one-to-one mapping between leaves of the suffix trie and suffixes of the text, t. So sometimes we'll think of the nodes of the suffix trie as having labels, where the label just spells out the characters that are on the path from the root to that node. So for example, this node here might have the label BAA, because if you look at the characters along the path from the root, they're BAA. We want to use the suffix trie as a index of the text t. So let's see some of the queries that we can pose where we can use the suffix trie to answer those queries. So first of all, let's see, how do we check whether or not some string s is a substring of t? So we talked about when building the suffix trie, we said that paths from the root down to the leaves corresponded to suffixes of t, and substrings of t are prefixes of suffixes of t. Right? Each of t's substrings is spelled out along some path from the root, not necessarily ending in a leaf. And so every substring is a prefix of some suffix of t. So if we want to determine whether some string s is a substring of t, we can use the following procedure. First of all, we're going to start at the root, and then we're going to follow edges that are labeled with the characters of s. So we'll go through the characters of s left to right. For each character, we're going to check to see if there's an outgoing edge from our current node that has that character as its label. If we ever find that that's not the case, if we ever find that there is no outgoing edge with the corresponding label, with the label that corresponds to the next character in S, then we say that we have fallen off the trie. We fell off the trie, and that means that S is not a substring of T. If that doesn't happen, if we exhaust all the characters of S without ever falling off the trie, then S is a substring of T. So let's try an example. So let's say our query string S is BAA. So if we start at the root, and we look for an outgoing edge labeled B, which is the first character of S, we find that there is one, so we follow that edge, and we move to the next character of S, which is an A. Is there an outgoing edge on A? Yes, there is. So we go to the next character of S, which is another A. Is there an outgoing edge on A? Yes, there is. So we've exhausted the characters from S, and at no point did we fall off the trie. So yes, this S is a substring of T, BAA. Let's try another example. Here's a longer one. So S is ABA, ABA. So we'll start at the root, and we'll look for outgoing edges labeled with the characters from S. A, B, A, B, A. So we were able to match all the characters from S without falling off the trie, so yes, S is a substring. Now let's try an example where we'll fail. So now the query string is BAABB. So we'll follow outgoing edges that match the characters from S, B, A, B, but then, oops, the next character from S is a B. There's no outgoing edge from this node labeled with B. So at that point, we fall off the try, and we say, no, this query string s is not a substring of t. Here's another query we might want to do. Now we'd like to check whether a string s is a suffix of t, not a substring, but a suffix of t. And just to be clear, when I say t, I mean t without the $sign on the end. So this is going to be similar to the procedure we did before. After all, a suffix is a kind of substring of s. In fact, we use basically the same procedure as we did for determining whether s was a substring, but then we additionally are going to check whether the final node in our walk had an outgoing edge labeled $sign. So let's look at an example. Here's a query string BAA. We follow that substring procedure where we start at the root and we follow outgoing edges labeled with BAA. We end up in this node here, and so now we're going to check whether this node has an outgoing edge labeled with $sign, but it does not. There's only one outgoing edge and it's labeled with B. That tells us that this S, BAA, is not a suffix of the text T. Here's an example where the query succeeds. So again, we start at the root, we follow the edges labeled with A, B, A, and then we check to see if it has a outgoing edge on $sign, and it does. So that tells us that ABA is a suffix of the original string T. Here's another query. So say we want to count the number of times some string S occurs as a substring of T. This one's a little bit harder to see how to do. But we can do it. So the way we do it is to, again, follow the path through the suffix try corresponding to our query string S. We might fall off in that process, in which case the answer is 0. S does not occur in T. It occurs 0 times in T. Or we might not fall off and end up at some node n, at which point the answer is just the number of leaf nodes in the subtree rooted at n. So let me show you an example. So let's say we're trying to figure out the number of times the query string ABA occurs in T. ABA is a substring of T, so when we follow the edges labeled ABA, we don't fall off the suffix try, and we end up in this node here. This is the node n. And so the answer is just the number of leaf nodes below n, the number of leaf nodes in the subtree rooted at n. There are 2 such leaf nodes. So now we know that the string ABA occurs twice in our text T. And how do we count the number of leaf nodes in that subtree? Well, we can do it, with using a very simple depth-first traversal down from n. So here's another question. How do we find the longest repeated substring of T? How do we find the longest substring of T that appears at least twice in T? That's a little tricky. Basically, we can just look for the deepest node in the suffix try that has more than one child. Right? That's going to correspond to the longest substring that occurs twice or more. So in this example, this is that node. This is the deepest node with more than one child. It corresponds to the substring ABA, and yes, ABA is the longest repeated substring in the string ABA. So here I'm showing you an implementation of a suffix try. It's pretty simple. It's a Python class, and this function here is the function that initializes the suffix try. So to make the suffix try, we start with this string T. T is the text. First thing we do is add on the special terminator symbol, which is $sign. We'll create a root node. Then we'll iterate over each suffix, or more accurately, we're iterating over the leftmost positions of all the suffixes. We're going to do something starting at the root, so we're going to let cur equal the root. And then for each character in the suffix that we're currently considering, we're going to go down from the root, and we're going to look to see if there's already an outgoing edge on the next character in the suffix. If there is, we'll follow it, and if there's not, we'll create it. And then follow it. So this creates the suffix trie. It's pretty simple. This function here is a helper that allows us to basically go from the root of the suffix trie and follow a path corresponding to the characters in some string s. So this is something that we were doing repeatedly in all of the examples that we saw previously. So if this is our query string s, we're going to start at the root, and we're going to walk down, and if the next character in s, if there is no outgoing edge corresponding to the next character in s, we're going to return none. None is just a symbol that means we fell off the trie, basically. But if there is an outgoing edge, then we'll follow that edge. And at the end, we'll return the node that we'll return the node that we ended up in. So here's a function that returns true when s appears as a substring of t, and so all it has to do is call this follow path function that we defined up here and check to see if the result is not none. If it's none, that means we fell off at some point. If it's not none, that means we exhausted all the characters from s without ever falling off. And finally, we have the has suffix function here, which starts at the root node and follows the path corresponding to s. And then it returns true if we did not fall off the trie, and if the node that we ended up in has an outgoing edge on the terminator, on $. And you can find a IPython notebook of this and some other code up on this website here. So how big is a suffix trie? On the one hand, we might, when we wrote down the number of characters and all the suffixes of a string, it grew as the square of the length of the string. On the other hand, we're doing some, the trie allows us to do some merging of similar prefixes of these strings. So let's work out some results about the best and the worst case here. So let's be optimistic and let's ask whether there's a class of string that we can write down where the number of nodes in the suffix trie for strings of that class grows linearly with the length m. So yeah, such a class would just be this class of strings that have the same character repeated m times in a row. And I'll shorthand that this way. For example, the class of strings that are just the character a repeated m times. So shown on the right-hand side here is a suffix trie for the string t equals a. And if you look at the structure of that suffix trie, it's not hard to see that what we have here is we're going to have one root, and then we're going to have these m nodes, 4 nodes in this case, but we'll have m nodes with an incoming a edge. And then we'll have m nodes, actually m plus 1 nodes, that should say m plus 1, with an incoming $sign edge. So that's for a total of 2m plus 2 nodes, not 2m plus 1. So that's a class of strings where the number of nodes in the suffix trie does grow linearly with the length of the string, although obviously this is a very simple class of strings. Next, we might ask whether there's a class of string where the number of suffix trie nodes grows with the square of the length of the string, grows with m squared. And so yes, so one example would be strings of the form a to the n, b to the n, or n a's strung together followed by n b's strung together. And over at the right-hand side is a figure showing a suffix trie for the string t equals AAA BBB. The $sign has been left off in this case. But it makes it easy to count up the types of nodes that would be in a suffix trie for a string of this form. There will be one root, and then there will be n nodes along this, you might call it the B chain on the right. This B chain is encoding all of the suffixes that consist of just B's. And then there's n nodes along what I'm calling the A chain here, which is sort of this backbone of all of the suffixes that start with some group of these A's. And then hanging off the A chains, hanging off the nodes in the A chain are more B chains. So hanging off of every node in the A chain is another chain of length n of B's. Right? And then there are the $ nodes, which again I haven't drawn in this figure. So if you add all that up, you have one root node. You have n nodes along that B chain to the right. You have n nodes along that A chain in the middle. And then you have a total of n squared nodes. You have n chains of n B nodes hanging off of the A chain nodes, these nodes down here. And then you have 2n plus 1 $ leaves, which are not shown in the figure at all. So the total number of nodes here is n squared plus 4n plus 2, and then m is 2n. Right? The length of the string is just 2n. So that's a class of strings where the number of suffix trie nodes grows with m squared. We might wonder whether this is the worst case, or whether it can be even worse than m squared. So let's think about that for a moment. Is order m squared the worst case number of nodes we can have in the suffix trie? Well, let's think about the dimensions of the suffix trie, the size of the suffix trie in terms of its height and its width. So I'm drawing a schematic suffix trie here. And first let's ask, what's the depth of the deepest leaf in the suffix trie? The leaf that has, the most number of edges between it and the root. Well, the deepest leaf corresponds to what? It corresponds to the longest suffix. And so let's say the length of the longest suffix is m plus 1 because, the plus 1 is because of the $. So the longest suffix of a t of length m is m plus 1 after we add the $. So now, what about the width of this suffix trie here? So this is a little harder to think about. But you can say that the width at any given level of the suffix trie, any given depth within the suffix trie, is equal to the number of distinct substrings of that length. So if we're at depth 3, we're looking at a number of nodes equal to the number of distinct substrings of length 3. And if you think about it, the maximum number of distinct substrings of any length has to be less than or equal to m. A way to think about that is, those substrings all have to fit within t. And so there can't be, for example, m substrings of length 2 within t, because that would actually require m plus 1 characters, and there are only m characters. So we can't have more than m distinct substrings of any length. So if the width of this tree is bounded by m, and the height of this tree is bounded by m plus 1, then yes, we can say that the worst case number of nodes in a suffix trie is in fact order m squared. Another question, which is, in some sense the most relevant question, is how do actual suffix tries grow as the lengths of actual strings increase? So this plot that I'm showing you here is the result of an empirical experiment where I built suffix tries for the first 500 prefixes of the lambdaphage virus genome. So this is, a genome of a virus. I just took successively longer prefixes of that virus genome, and for each I built a suffix trie, and I simply counted the number of nodes in that suffix trie and plotted it, and that's what this black line is showing. And it's in between these other two lines, this red line and this blue line. The red line is showing literally m squared. So this I just plotted, m squared, and that's what this red line is. And the blue line is just m. And so not too surprisingly, this black line is in between m and m squared, but it does seem to be growing superlinearly. It seems pretty clear this is growing quadratically or at least superlinearly. So in practice, suffix tries do grow quadratically or at least superlinearly with the length of the string that's being indexed. So this makes the suffix trie rather impractical. Superlinear growth means we end up with a trie that's quite large compared to the length of the input text t. You can see that even in this relatively small example, we've indexed a prefix of this genome that's of length 500, and the number of suffix trie nodes that we get is up over 100,000. So that's a really, really, really big data structure to index a string that's only 500 characters long. So we're going to think of a few ways that we could make this suffix trie a bit smaller. So the first that we'll examine has to do with compressing paths in the tree, in the trie. So here's an example here, this path here. We can coalesce this path so that at the end of the day, we've reduced the number of nodes in the trie. And we've done this by coalescing the non-branching paths into a single edge. And the label for that edge is now going to be a string, not a single character, but a string. So if we take just this subtree here and apply this idea, this coalescing idea, we end up with a new subtree that looks like this. We still have this $ child, but now instead of a string of nodes labeled A, B, A, $, we have just one child node where the edge to that child node is labeled A, B, A, $. The edge is now labeled with a string. So this reduces the total number of nodes and edges in the graph clearly. And it also does something interesting, which is it guarantees that internal nodes in this tree, non-leaf nodes in this tree, have more than one child, right? Because all the nodes that had exactly one child were coalesced away. So all the internal nodes of the tree, after this coalescing procedure, have more than one child. So again, here's a suffix trie that we have done this coalescing procedure on. How many leaves does this trie have? This compacted trie have? Well, again, it has m or m+1 if you count the $ leaves. And so, how many non-leaf nodes does it have? Well, we just said that all of the non-leaf nodes have at least 2 children. And one thing you might remember about binary trees, so a binary tree is just a tree where all of the non-leaf nodes have exactly 2 children. One thing you might remember about a binary tree is that if the number of leaf nodes is m, then the number of non-leaf nodes is exactly m-1. So for this kind of tree that we just built, all of the internal nodes, all of the non-leaf nodes, have at least 2 children, which means that the number of non-leaf nodes is at most m-1. At most the number of nodes that the number of non-leaf nodes we would have if this were a binary tree. So this is the number of leaves, and this is the maximum number of non-leaf nodes we can have. So that means that the upper bound on the total number of nodes we can have in this compacted trie grows with m, not with m squared. So we now have a data structure with order m nodes in the worst case. Now, we ask ourselves, do we have a data structure where the total amount of memory required to hold the entire data structure is bounded, asymptotically order m in the worst case? So we reduce the number of nodes so that is bounded by m. But what about the total size? No, there's still something about this data structure that grows with m squared. And basically it's the total length of all the labels on all these edges. If you add together the lengths of all the labels on all these edges, that still grows with m squared in the worst case. So we improved something about the data structure, but we're still not finished trying to make the whole data structure fit in order M space. So we can fix this too. So let's say that instead of just storing this compacted trie, we also store t. So we keep t. Sort of t comes along for the ride. T is part of our index. So if we have t, we can convert the tree's edge labels, like this label here, to another form. We can just convert it to a pair of numbers, where that pair of numbers is just an offset and a length with respect to t. Now what do I mean by that? This string here is a substring of t, and because it's a substring of t, we can identify it with an offset. In this case the offset is 0, 1, 2, 3. The offset is 3. And a length, which is 4. So this edge we can re-encode as just 3, 4. And we can do that for all the edges. So here's that 3, 4 edge re-encoded. So now instead of the edges having strings on them, strings labeling them, they just have pairs of numbers, and these pairs of numbers refer to substrings of t. So now the total amount of data taken up by the whole data structure is upper bounded by m. It's in the worst case order m. So one last detail about the suffix tree is that at these leaves, at the leaves of the tree, we're going to store a number, and that number represents the offset of the suffix that leaf corresponds to. So for example, the longest suffix, the suffix that consists of the entire string $, we would say that has offset 0, and so the node that corresponds, the leaf node that corresponds to that longest suffix, which in this case is this node here, is labeled with 0. So each of these nodes is labeled with some number, 0 up to the length of $t minus 1. Each has a distinct label, again, because there's a one-to-one mapping from leaf nodes to suffixes. So let's just do one more example. So this node up here has offset 6, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, because it corresponds to the shortest suffix, the suffix that just consists of $sign. So here's our suffix tree again. I want to make a point about node labels. So just like with suffix tries, each node's label just equals the concatenated edge labels from the root down to the node. And these are not stored explicitly in the tree, but nonetheless we say that each node has a label. So here, the label is BA. Remember, this is offset 1, length 2. So here's offset 1, length 2, that's BA. So we would say that node has label BA. And then this node down here has the following label. In order to compose that label, we have to take this string, 0, 1. 0, 1 is just A. And then concatenate this string. The string is 3, 4. 3, 4 is 0, 1, 2, 3. A, B, A, $. So it should be A, B, A, $. Also, unlike the suffix try, where the edges, the labels on the edges were all characters, now we can have string labels on the edges. And so it's important for us now to distinguish between two different notions of depth into the tree. So one notion of depth is node depth, which basically means how many edges do we have to follow from the root to reach that node. So let's take a simple example. Let's take this node here. So this node has a node depth of 1. We have to follow one edge to get to this node. Then there's the notion of label depth. This is just the total length of all the edge labels for the edges that are on the path from the root to the node. So let's take that same node again. What is this node's label depth? Well, it's 2. right? Remember these pairs here mean offset, length. So the length of the string labeling this edge is 2. So this node's label depth is 2. And just to pick a slightly more complicated example, let's pick this node here. This node's node depth is 2, and this node's label depth is 6. 2 plus 4. Here's a minor point, but it's one worth talking about because students often bring this up in class, and I hear people thinking about this point. So we said that the space taken by the edge labels was order m in the worst case because we're just keeping these two integers, the offset and the length integers, for each edge, and there are order m edges, so that's order m space. But you might say, well, to store one of those integers, we need an amount of space that is related to m, right? We need enough bits. To store one of those integers, we need enough bits to distinguish the m positions in T. So for example, this first integer in a pair, that's an offset into the text T. And in order to represent all of the offsets into the text T, we need enough bits to distinguish m positions, and that's ceiling of the log base 2 of the number of positions in T. So that's this expression here. But we usually just ignore this factor. This does not appear in the bound that we report. We don't say it's order m times log base 2 of m. And that's because, for all intents and purposes, the number of bits in a typical modern machine word, 64 bits say, is plenty, right? 64 bits is plenty to refer to, every offset into, it's enough to refer to an offset within a string that is the concatenation of all the genomes that have ever been sequenced. So we typically ignore this factor. And then you can make a similar argument for the pointers or the references or whatever you're using to point to the various nodes of this tree in the tree data structure, right? You need to be able to distinguish among the nodes of the tree, and there are order m nodes. So again, you need some sort of factor of log base 2 of m to store one of those pointers or one of those references. So that's a small caveat to keep in mind. So how do we build a suffix tree? We have a suffix tree now. That's what this is. How do we build one of these? So one way is to build it in the same way that we described it, which is we started with a suffix trie, and then we coalesced the non-branching paths, and then we relabeled the edges so that instead of having strings, they had these pairs of integers labeling the edges. So that's one method. Another method is actually kind of similar to that first method, except we're keeping all of the edge labels as integers, and we're keeping all of the paths as being coalesced from the very beginning. And so another way to think of how this method works is you can build a very simple tree that has just two nodes connected by an edge, and that tree represents just the longest suffix. Then we can repeatedly augment this tree so that it includes progressively shorter suffixes as well. So we would augment it with the second longest suffix, and then the third longest suffix, etc. Now, if you think about the time and space requirements of these two methods, method 1 is clearly order m squared time and order m squared space in the worst case, because we have to build the suffix trie first. And the suffix trie is order m squared nodes, so it's order m squared time and space in the worst case. This second method is probably order m space, right? It seems like it's order m space because we're starting with something that's smaller than the suffix tree we will eventually get, and we're only adding to it in order to get to the eventual suffix tree. We're not taking anything away. So at no point should the size of the data structure that we're building here with naive method 2 ever exceed the size of the suffix tree that we eventually get. So that's order m, and the size of the suffix tree as we established is order m. But this method is order m squared time. So what we have now are two algorithms, both of which are order m squared, use order m squared time. But this second one uses order m space. And for a more detailed description of naive method 2, you can see Gusfield, because that method is described in this section of the Gusfield textbook. So I'm going to show you an implementation of that naive method 2. Here it is. So this algorithm is order m squared time order m space in the worst case. And here is where we start out with our 2-node tree, very simple tree which corresponds just to the longest suffix of the text t. And now here we have a loop where we're iterating over all the successively shorter suffixes. So we're starting with the second longest suffix and going all the way to the shortest. And we are, in each case, walking down the tree and then refining it appropriately to include that additional suffix. And as you can see, this is a somewhat involved implementation. This is not nearly as simple as the code we had for the suffix try. And this, is because of the fact that the paths are compacted and the fact that the edge labels are what they are. It's just a little bit more complicated to make this tree. And perhaps the most complex case we have to deal with is where the addition of the new suffix requires that we take an edge that was labeled with some string uv, say that u and v are strings, and so this is the concatenation of u and v. And we then had to split that edge in order to add a new edge and a new leaf node. That's the most sort of complex case we have to deal with in this code here. So this slide is just the code for building the tree. We also have a function here for following a path down from the root of the tree. This function is the analog of the follow path function we already saw for the suffix try. And again, this is a little bit more complicated than what we did for the suffix try because the edges are compacted, so they might have string labels. So as we descend through the suffix tree, sometimes we're jumping from node to node, but sometimes we're just moving along the string that's labeling an edge in the tree. And then these two are very similar. Has substring and has suffix both call follow path and look at the return value to see whether we fell off in this case, and then to check to see if we did not fall off, whether the node that we're currently in or whether the next character on the edge label that we ended on is a $sign. And you can see this example along with some code where we actually use it to answer some simple queries up at this link here. So here's the suffix tree analog of that plot I showed you earlier before we said that the suffix try grew as the number of characters in the string squared. It grew as m squared in the worst case. And then we plotted how it actually grows in practice. Now we want to make a similar plot for the suffix tree. So I did the same experiment. I took the first 500 prefixes of the lambda phage genome, and I built a suffix tree for all of them. And then for each I counted up the number of nodes in the suffix tree and I plotted it, and that's what this black line here is. So what's interesting is that the black line lies entirely between m, which is about the minimum number of nodes we can expect in a suffix tree, and 2m, which is about the maximum number of nodes that we can expect. And it seems to be growing linearly, as we would expect. And we can contrast this again with the suffix try. Remember we said that for this prefix of length 500, the suffix try had over 100,000 nodes. It had about 120,000 nodes. Here with the suffix tree, if we go out to 500 and look at the number of nodes that the suffix tree has, it's between 700 and 800. It's drastically smaller. So there are less naive methods for building a suffix tree. There are a few different algorithms that are capable of building a suffix tree in both order m time and space. This is perhaps surprising. It's hard to think offhand of how you could do this in order m time. And probably the most famous and the most widely used algorithm for doing this is called Ukonen's algorithm. And it was published here in this paper, Online Construction of Suffix Trees. This paper is called Online Construction of Suffix Trees because it has a certain online property, namely that if you are giving me the characters of t, of the text t, one character at a time, instead of just giving me all of t, Ukonen's algorithm essentially can efficiently update its suffix tree upon each arrival, upon the arrival of each subsequent character. Ukonen's algorithm is a very, very cool algorithm to learn about. It's also pretty messy. It's an algorithm with lots of, in order to think about it, you have to think through lots of case analyses and cases and subcases. So we won't really cover it in class, but Gusfield covers it in great depth. In fact, an entire chapter of Gusfield is basically dedicated to understanding Ukonen's algorithm and related algorithms. So we're able to query the suffix tree in much the same way that we were able to query the suffix try. It's just that when we answer these queries, we have to traverse the suffix tree, which is more complex because the edges can have strings labeling them. So let's look at a few examples. So how would we check whether a string s is a substring of t? Well, we just use essentially the same procedure as we used for the suffix try, where we started at the root and then walked down the tree according to the characters from s. We just have to now deal with these coalesced edges. So if our query string, for example, is BAA, then we're going to walk along this edge here, and we're going to do that in two steps. First, we're going to walk up to that B, and then we're going to walk up to that A, and that puts us in this node here. Then we have one more character to consume from S, which is this A. So that moves us one character along this edge here. But the fact that we didn't fall off the suffix tree tells us that yes, BAA is a substring of our text T. The deal with the suffix is very similar. We follow this same procedure. We're gonna follow the path dictated by the characters of the string S, A, BA, and then we can check to see whether the next if we're in a node, we check to see whether that node has an outgoing edge labeled with $sign. If we're in the middle of an edge, that's another case. For example, if our query were A, BA, ABA, that would put us here. We'd be in the middle of an edge. Then we would check to see whether the next character on the edge is a $sign, in which case, yes, it's a suffix. How do we count the number of times the string S occurs as a substring in T? Same procedure. So say the string we want to count is just the string ABA. Again, we walk down from the root ABA. And then just like we did before, we're going to say, I'm going to figure out how many leaf nodes are below, are in the subtree rooted at the node that my walk ended in. So we'll find these two. So we can use either the suffix try or the suffix tree to answer a question like this. So with a suffix tree of t, we can find all of the matches of p to t. We can also tell you where those matches occurred. So let's let k equal the number of matches of p to t. And let's use this example where our pattern p is AB and our text t is ABA, ABA, and we've added the $sign. And so here's our suffix tree for that text. And you'll note that I've in the previous few slides and in this slide, I've reverted to labeling the edges with actual strings instead of with those integer pairs. We would use those integer pairs in reality to annotate these edges, but just for the purpose of explanation for illustration, I'm putting the strings back. So how would we go about this? Well, first we'd walk down the path corresponding to AB. That's this path here, A, and then B. So we're partway along this edge at the end of that walk. If we fall off, there are no matches. In this case, we did not fall off. We're still on the tree right there. And then we would visit all the leaf nodes below that point, the point where we ended our walk. And we'd report each leaf offset as a match offset for our pattern P. So in this example, we would then descend into this subtree. We'd do, say, a depth-first traversal. We'd keep track of all the leaf nodes we encounter. And for each of those leaf nodes, the offset written in that leaf node is the offset where P occurs in T. So we obtain two such offsets, 0 and 3. And lo and behold, if we look at P and T, we see that there is one occurrence of P at offset 0, and there's one occurrence of P at offset 0, 1, 2, 3. So this procedure, walking down the path that corresponds to AB, if we say the pattern is length n, that's an order n procedure. This procedure here, visiting all the leaf nodes below the point where we ended and then reporting each leaf offset as a match offset, this is an order k procedure where k is the number of matches. Why is that order k? Why does it only order k time to do that depth first traversal? Well, again, this tree down here, you can think of the subtree that we're exploring as being like a mini suffix tree. It has the same property that all of the non-leaf nodes have at least two children. And if there are k leaf nodes, that means the total number of nodes in that whole subtree is order k. So a depth first traversal is only going to visit order k nodes. It's only going to take order k time. So overall, solving this problem is an order n plus k algorithm. So let's talk about a real-world problem that suffix trees are used to solve. In fact, this is one of the first places where suffix trees were used in computational biology, in computational genomics. So the problem here is that we have two genomes. Maybe they're closely related genomes, as in this case. Here's one genome of the bacterium Helicobacter pylori. Here's another strain of Helicobacter pylori. So these are two closely related but different genomes. And what I'm showing you here in this plot is basically everywhere where you see a dot that's either red or green, you see where there's sequence similarity between the two genomes. In other words, these dots are, well, specifically what these dots are so-called maximal unique matches. And maximal unique matches are just a kind of long substring that's shared by the two sequences. And the difference between red and green is whether the match was between like strands or different strands of the DNA. So this is one way that people like to compare two genomes. And once you've compared the two genomes this way and made a plot that looks like this, often called a dot plot, it's easy to see what some of the major events were in evolution that distinguished these two strains. So, for example, they're mostly lining up pretty well with each other, but there are these inversion events, and these inversion events cause these green boxes here. And then you can see there are also the sort of smaller inversion events that lead to these green lines here and here, and these green lines up here. So a suffix tree is going to help us come up with these maximal unique matches. Let's see how. Alright, so let's solve the following problem, which is very related to the one from the previous slide. Finding the longest common substring between two strings x and y. So say we want to find this longest common substring, or LCS, of two strings x and y. We're going to do it through the following procedure. We're going to make a new string, x hash y dollar. And both hash and dollar are terminal symbols. So we've been using the dollar sign as the terminal symbol up until now. But just imagine now we have two terminal symbols, both hash and dollar. And let's just say, and so both hash and dollar are less than A, C, G, and T. But we can just arbitrarily say hash is less than dollar or dollar is less than hash. Doesn't really matter. They're both used as terminal symbols. And now we can build the suffix tree for this longer string. So here's our x, and here's our y, and here's our new string, x hash y dollar. Here it is here. And here's the suffix tree that we build when we build the suffix tree of this string here. It's a little complicated, but the main thing I want to highlight is that some of these suffixes, right, all the leaves correspond to suffixes, and some of those suffixes are non-empty suffixes of x, and some of those suffixes are non-empty suffixes of y. So for example, the suffix at offset 0, and at offset 1, and at offset 2, 3, 4, those suffixes all represent non-empty suffixes of x. And then the suffixes at 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, those all represent non-empty suffixes of y. So that means if we look along a path, so let's look along this path xa, for example, we can sort of eyeball the two strings and see that xa only occurs in the string x. So let's go along this path xa. We're in this node. All of the suffixes under this node are non-empty suffixes of x, right? 0, 3, 0, 3. So we know that this node corresponds to a prefix of two suffixes, both of x. But what we're looking for is a node that corresponds to the deepest node that corresponds to a prefix of suffixes of both x and y. So the procedure that we can use is the following. We can traverse this tree, the whole tree, do something like a depth first traversal, and then we're going to annotate each non-leaf node according to whether the leaves below it include suffixes of x or suffixes of y or both. Right? So the node we already considered, this node here, the leaves under this node correspond only to suffixes of x, not to suffixes of y. But this node here, for example, this node which corresponds to just the substring x, the substring x appears in both x and y, and so this node is annotated with both x and y. This is a suffix of x here, this is a suffix of x here, but this, the suffix at offset 9, is a suffix of y. So once we've done this annotation, the next question is, what's the deepest node that's annotated with both x and y? And it's this node here. And that node's label is the longest common substring between x and y. In this case, that label is ABX. ABX. And indeed, you can see that ABX is in x and ABX is in y, and there's no longer substring that's in both x or y. Both x and y. And so, how much time does this take? What's the time complexity of this whole procedure for finding the LCS of x and y? Well, what did we do? Well, one of the things we did was build this suffix tree, and that required, say we used Ukonen's algorithm. Ukonen's algorithm requires time linear in the string being indexed, the string over which we're building the suffix tree. So in this case, that's the length of x plus the length of y plus 2. But basically, we can do that in order length of x plus length of y time. Then we did this depth first traversal to annotate all these nodes, but that again is also order length x plus length y. So overall, we used order length x plus length y time and space. So this technique of taking multiple strings and composing them together and then building a suffix tree over all of those composed strings, this technique in general is called generalized suffix strings. Generalized suffix trees. When we build a suffix tree over many strings at once, this is called a generalized suffix tree. And there are many, many applications where it's useful to build a generalized suffix tree. And for more information, you can see Gus Field, section 6.4. Suffix trees are a good example of a interesting indexing approach that has found lots of uses in real computational biology software, real genomics software. One of the first examples was a tool called Mummer. I actually already referenced Mummer. That dot plot I showed you earlier was produced by Mummer. This is a very popular tool. It's been cited over 2,000 times. It's a tool for whole genome alignment. So again, like that example I showed you before, it's intended to compare whole genome sequences for two or more species that are related through evolution. And here's another example is a tool called Reputer. This is a tool for computing and visualizing repeats in whole genomes. You've already seen how we can discover things about repeats using suffix trees, right? We figured out what was the longest string that occurred at least twice. The longest substring that occurred at least twice in T. And then we also did that LCS problem. Those are both related to trying to find repeats. And then another use is in trying to find sequence motifs, which are essentially sequences that are overrepresented in some way, a sequence that occurs more often than you would expect, presumably because it's important in doing something. And it's used in other areas as well, including multiple alignment. That's when you're trying to align not just two sequences, but two or more sequences. So I want to show you a couple practical results of what it's like to use a tool based on a suffix tree. So I'm going to show you what it's like to run the tool Mummer. And so here I am running Mummer on the command line. And I'm giving it a reference text here, a reference genome here. In this case, it's just chromosome 1 from the human genome. And this is a particular version of the human genome build, HG19. And then this here is a string. This is my query string. And in this case, it's this same 50 nucleotide sequence that I've been using for other examples. And it's taken from the ALU repeat element. So this is a string we expect to see multiple times in the human genome. And so when we give Mummer these two strings, it then proceeds to build a suffix tree of the reference text. So here we go. This is Mummer building a suffix tree of chromosome 1 of the human genome. And this takes it about 2 minutes. Then it goes and it uses that index to look for places where this string occurs. Right? We already sort of saw how to do that. So each of these rows down here is basically a place where the ALU string occurs within the human genome. And it's pretty heartening and impressive that building a suffix tree of all of chromosome 1 is about 250 million nucleotides long, that takes only about 2 minutes. I also did a series of experiments to confirm that the amount of memory used by Mummer and the amount of time used by Mummer when it builds a suffix tree of a string, that both those things grow linearly with the length of the string. For this, to make this plot here, I divided chromosome 1, human chromosome 1, up into prefixes. So this is a very short prefix. This is a prefix that contains about 20% of chromosome 1. This is a prefix that contains 40%, etc. So I ran all of these increasingly long prefixes through Mummer, and then I asked what was the peak memory usage when I ran Mummer and had it build a suffix tree over that sequence. And you can see that this is scaling linearly. So that's what we expect. Over here now I'm evaluating the time it took to build the suffix tree index. And again, it's scaling pretty much linearly. So good, that's what we expect. We expect the time required to build the suffix tree to scale linearly with the length of the string, and the memory usage to scale linearly with the length of the string. Now, what happens when we ask Mummer to build an index of the entire human reference genome? The whole thing, not just chromosome 1. And the entire human reference genome, again, is about 3 billion nucleotides long. Well, it doesn't like that. That's longer than its maximum permitted text length that it can possibly index. But if we were to extrapolate based on the amount of memory it needed to index just chromosome 1, we can predict that it would have taken about 47 gigabytes of memory in order to fit its suffix tree index of the human genome in memory. So that's a lot, 47 gigabytes. What we can say about building a suffix tree is that being able to do it in linear time and linear space is very desirable. But there's also the question of the constant in front of the m. Even if it's linear, is the constant factor large? Is the index, we like how the index is growing, but is the index itself just too big to be practical? And the constant factor in terms of how much space the suffix tree takes up varies quite a bit depending on the implementation. So you can imagine the exact data structures used to store the nodes and the edges of the suffix tree matter. And you can be clever about trying to compact those data structures as much as possible. So if we could estimate the Mummer constant factor, the thing that gets multiplied by m when we increase m, to determine the actual size of the data structure, it seems like it's about 15.75 bytes per node. So as we increase, if we increase the size of the graph by one node, we add 15.75 bytes to that data structure. And if we look around in the literature for examples where people have really tried to minimize this number, they've really tried to make the suffix tree as small as possible. Even then, the smallest realistic number that we can find is that the suffix tree takes up about 12.5 bytes per node. So if we were to build, again, an index of the human genome, and this were the number of bytes per node, this was the bytes that we needed per node, we'd be using something on the order of 35 or 40 gigabytes of memory or more. So this wraps up our discussion of suffix trees. So a suffix tree organizes all of the suffixes of a text into a pretty useful and pretty flexible data structure that we can build in order m time and space. The naive method that we evaluated first, the suffix trie, occupied quadratic time and space, which is perhaps what you would expect when you consider that we're organizing all of the suffixes of the text, and the total number of characters in all the suffixes of the text grows as the square of n. Suffix trees are used in practice quite a bit. They're used in whole genome alignment. They're used to identify repeats, etc. But when you actually look at these practical tools, you'll find that the memory footprint, the number of bytes that we have to use to store about a suffix tree, is quite high, which limits its usefulness. And so that's what's going to motivate the next couple of indexing data structures that we look at.